Hey everybody, it's Courtney and I'm here with another video for Trinity Stamps. Today I am going to be using one of the new stamp sets that will be released in just a few days. And I'm going to be creating a one-layer scene card here, which I know can be intimidating. I get a lot of comments that one-layer scenes are difficult or time-consuming, so we're going to make this really simple. So I'm starting off by stamping out my little deer here, and I am going to go ahead and mask that out. I did not bother to cut out the antlers. These were way too intricate. So I know I was going to be using a light distress ink color in the background, so I knew I'd be able to color over it anyway. Next, I'm going to start with my largest trees, and I'm masking as I go, and I'm starting with the trees that are going to be in front of the others. So I'm stamping the ones that are towards the front of the panel, masking those out, and then I'll move on to the ones in the background. And there's two different size trees in this stamp set. So my largest ones will be in the front, and then I'll put a couple smaller trees in the back. And I am masking all of them because I am going to be doing some ink blending in the background. Now you can see I didn't get a great impression on some of these just because I was not careful, but we'll fix that with a Copic Save Pen after all of our stamping is done before we move on to our coloring. Now, when you're cutting out your masks, you want to make sure that you're cutting right along that black line, not outside of it and not too far inside of it, or else you're going to have some bleeding when you do your ink blending, or you'll be left with a white outline around your image after your ink blending is done. Once all of my images were stamped and masked, I'm taking a larger piece of Eclipse masking paper here, and I'm just taking my scissors and cutting a squiggly line and masking out the bottom part of my card panel, and we're going to be doing some distress ink blending for our sky. And I'm going to be using four colors here. I'm using Salty Ocean, Blueprint Sketch, Chipped Sapphire, and Seedless Preserves. So I'm starting with my lightest color. This is the Salty Ocean, and I'm starting right along that mask. Then I'll move on to the next darkest color, which is the Blueprint Sketch, then the Chipped Sapphire, and then the Seedless Preserves right on the top. Now this is going to look really messy before we finish here, but once I make my way up to the top of the card panel, I'll work my way back down using those same colors over that same area just to get a better blend. And you'll notice that I'll keep going over some of these areas if I'm not too happy with the way it's coming out. Like I kind of lost my purple there, I'll go back in and add a little bit more and then blend that out with the Blueprint Sketch just to kind of lighten up the sky just a little bit. Now you can see that some of my masks were kind of coming up, so you want to just move your ink blending tool in the direction of that image so that you don't get too much bleeding. We're going to be coloring these trees pretty dark anyway, so most of the lighter colors will be able to be covered. Once my sky was done, I went ahead and removed that bottom mask. And I'm just going to take a piece of that same Eclipse masking paper down towards the bottom, and I'm going to just cut a curve. I'm freehanding this. This does not need to be perfect. And I'm placing this in various areas underneath. And I'm using the Shaded Lilac Distress ink. And I'm just going along the edge of the mask itself. And this will make it look as if there is hills of snow in the background. And I'm pretty much concentrating my little hills where my trees are and where my deer is. And I'm going in with, there's quite a bit of ink on my ink blending tool. I want to make sure that the hills are noticeable. You can make these as faint or as dark as you'd like. You can go in with a blue. I just like the Shaded Lilac for snow. Once I had all of my hills down, I'm going to go back in with that same Shaded Lilac, but I'm not going to re-ink my tool, my ink blending tool. And if I do, I'm blotting off on my scrap piece of paper there quite a bit. And I'm going in with a very, very light hand, barely touching the paper here, and just going over my entire area so that those hills blend out just a little bit and they're not too distinct. Once all of my ink blending was done, I went ahead and removed my masks. And I'm going to take an EK Success Journaling pen, which is a Copic Safe pen. There's a lot of them out there. And I'm just going to touch up some of the areas of my trees that I didn't get that great of an impression before I move on to the coloring. You can still see the lines, and most of these will be covered up when we do our coloring anyway, but I just wanted to have a bolder outline there. So for the coloring, we are going to keep this simple as well. I'm going to just show you one of the trees. I colored each and every one of these the same, and I like to flick away from me. I find that easier for me. Some people like to flick towards you, whatever's easier for you. I'm starting with my lightest color and just mapping out my darkest areas, which will be underneath these little sections of the trees, branches, I guess. Going in with my darkest color and just adding a few little flicks. I'm not going very far down, but this will be the darkest area of my trees. Next, I'll blend that out with my G46, and I'm just extending those flicks out a little bit further. Then moving on to my G24, extending those flicks out even further yet, and leaving just a small highlight on those sections for my lightest color. When I do go in with my lightest color, I am going in the opposite direction. I'm starting from the bottom and flicking my way up just so that I don't overblend here, and I'm able to still keep all of that contrast in color. For the little trunk of the tree, I am again going to just map out my darkest area with my lightest color, which is the E55, and my darkest area will be right underneath the tree itself. Going in with the E59, blending that out with the E57, and then again back to that E55. Like I said, I colored all of the trees the same way, and then we'll move on to the deer. So again, starting with my lightest color and mapping out my darkest areas. This helps to get a better blend. It just, once the paper is saturated, you will get a better blend. You don't have to go in with your lightest color. You can certainly go right in with your darkest. I just find this to be a little bit easier. Next, I'm going in with my darkest color and adding my shading. My shading is going to be off to the left side of him and down the one side of his leg, the left side of his leg, and the leg that's kind of tucked behind the other. There'll also be a shadow underneath his little scarf there, and then off to the left side of his neck. Next, I'll go in with my E33, and I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit, and this is where I will start my flicking, and I'm kind of just pushing that color out, pushing that E37 out. And there's not going to be too much of a highlight on his legs. Those are teeny tiny areas, but I was able to get 3 of the 4 colors that I used in. Next, I'll go in with the E31 and doing the same thing again, just pushing that color out, blending that out, and just leaving a small highlight there on his back and on his little nose where he's kind of looking up in the air. And I'll go back in with that E30 and just blend the rest of those highlight areas out. Now for his antlers there, I'm just going to go in with my E31 and just using the very tip of my marker. These are teeny tiny areas. I also get a lot of comments about how to get into these little tiny areas with your Copics. You'll notice that my pen is pretty much straight up in the air. It's pretty much perpendicular to the paper, and I'm just barely touching the paper. In fact, sometimes my marker skips a little bit and I have to go back. But if you do go outside of the lines, especially if it's a lighter color like this, just go in with your colorless blender and touch up any of those areas. You can use that colorless blender on regular distress ink with no problem. For his little hooves, I'm using the E59 and E57 like we did on the trunks of the trees. And for his scarf, I wanted to make this a red and white striped. So I'm just going to go in with 2 colors of red here. And if you want to do any shading on your white areas, do that first before you go in with your red, because reds tend to bleed and blend out in places that you don't necessarily want it to go. So I'm just using 2 colors here, the R46 and R43, just to give a little bit of dimension to these little stripes. And I did go in with my C1 to add a little bit of shading to the white areas and then realized that wasn't going to work. My red is going to bleed. So I pretty much just left those white with just a little bit of a hint of that C1. Last, I wanted to add a few little shadows underneath my trees and my deer's feet there. So I'm taking a BV02, which is just a little bit darker than this shaded lilac. I'm just putting a few little flicks underneath each of the trees and his feet. And I took my colorless blender because I don't have a lighter color than the BV02 and just went over that area quickly to blend that out just a little bit. Once all of my coloring was done, I'm going to take a sentiment from that same stamp set and just lining that up on my grid mat here. And I did stamp this on just a scrap piece of paper with that same black ink that we used for the images, just to make sure that it was lined up before I stamped that on my card panel. And I'm going to be white heat embossing this. So I'm going to treat the area with my anti-static tool. Now you want to make sure that your distress ink is completely dry before you do this. You might want to test it out before you stamp and emboss. Distress ink tends to stay wet for quite some time, and we put a whole lot of ink on there. So I'm stamping this with my Versamark ink, and there's also some stars of all different sizes in the stamp set, and I'm just going to stamp those also with the Versamark ink, kind of scattered throughout my sky. I'm just using 2 of the stars here. I think there's one that's even larger than these, but I'm just putting a few there in the sky to kind of match my sentiment. Then I'm going to use white embossing powder by Hero Arts, sprinkle that over that entire area. And there were a few little areas that I needed to clean up with a dry paintbrush where I had some embossing powder stick to areas that I didn't necessarily want it to. Once that was heat set, my paper was a little bit warped. And whenever I have that, I find it easier to adhere my card panel to my card base with a liquid glue. So I'm going to be using the Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere this flat to an A2 size card base. And last, I wanted to add a few more details to my little scene here. So I'm going to take a white gel pen and I'm going to add a little bit of snow to some of these trees, or actually all of these trees. And I'm just following the lines within the image. And this is where it didn't really matter if I went over it with that Copic Safe pen, because I'm going to go over the same areas with my white gel pen, and this will just make it appear as if there is snow on the trees. And I added this to all 5 of the trees. And I also added a little bit of sparkle to the inside of the little stars in the sky, as well as the deer's scarf and the little stars that are hanging from him as well. And that's the card for today, guys. Thanks a lot for stopping by and have a great day. Bye.